A hand grabbed the back of a wheelchair and shoved it out onto the porch. The old man's coffee cup hit the boards and shattered. He grabbed the wheels, tried to stop, but his arms weren't strong enough anymore. A truck engine turned over in the driveway. Gravel sprayed. Someone tossed a set of house keys onto his lap and told him the papers were already signed. He looked down at his own hands, the same hands that fed and raised the 3 people now driving away in his truck. Nobody even looked back. Not one of them. His name was Emmett Cavanaugh, 40 years a sawmill foreman, and in a single morning his children took everything he owned. They left him one thing, a rotting cabin they thought was worthless. What his old dog dug up under that floor changed all of it. Stay with me on this one. Let me tell you about Emmett's hands because you need to understand them. For 40 years, those hands ran the big saw at the Cedar Falls mill up in the timber country of Montana. He could measure a log with one look and tell you the board feet inside it. He lost the tip of one finger in 1979, wrapped it in a rag, and went back to work the same week. Men who worked under him said he never raised his voice, never had to. When Emmett Cavanaugh told you to do something, you did it, because he'd already done it himself 1,000 times and never once asked a man to do what he wouldn't. He was the first truck in the lot every morning and the last one out. And in all those years, he never took a sick day he could stand up through. He raised 3 kids on a foreman's wages. His wife Ruth passed when the youngest was still in high school, and Emmett did the rest alone. Packed lunches, sat through recitals with sawdust still under his nails, cossined a car loan for Dale, the oldest, paid for Marlene's wedding, every dollar of it, and never mentioned the cost. Wired money to Colton, the baby of the family, more times than he could count. When Dale's first business went under, it was Emmett who covered the debt so his boy wouldn't lose his name in a small town. He never kept score. That was the thing about him. He gave and figured that was what a father was for. He thought the giving built something. He thought it would come back around when he needed it. Every man makes that bet. Emmett lost it. Then 2 winters back, the stroke came. It hit him in his own kitchen on a Tuesday morning. One second he was pouring coffee, the next the floor came up at him, and the whole right side of his body just quit. He couldn't call out. He couldn't reach the phone on the counter above him. He lay there 4 hours, watching the light move across the floorboards before a neighbor found him through the window. The doctors saved his life. They couldn't give back his legs. From that day on, Emmett Cavanaugh got around in a wheelchair, and the man who'd carried logs on his shoulder now needed help getting into bed. That's when his children got busy. Not with soup, not with visits, with paperwork. Dale knew a lawyer. Marlene knew about the money. Colton mostly stayed quiet and looked at his shoes. They sat around Emmett's hospital bed and told him it was all for his own protection. Sign here, Dad. This puts the house in our name so the nursing home can't take it. This just lets us manage the pension so the bills get paid on time. He was groggy from the medication, half his face still frozen, the words swimming on the page in front of him. And he trusted them the way he'd always trusted them. So he signed. Every page they slid across that bed tray, he signed, because these were his children, and it never once crossed his mind that his own blood would sit at his bedside and rob him. And here's the thing. The nursing home was never the plan. The plan was the house. Within a month, Dale had moved his own family into Emmett's home. The house Emmett built additions onto with his own 2 hands, the porch he framed, the back room he added when Colton was born. Marlene took over the bank account and the pension check stopped landing anywhere Emmett could reach it. And the truck, that old green Ford that Emmett kept running for 20 years, Colton drove off in it and never brought it back. In 8 weeks, the man who'd owned everything he ever touched owned nothing at all. And nobody in that family said a word about it. They just moved him around like a piece of furniture that didn't fit the room anymore. They didn't put him in a home. That would have cost money. Instead, they told him about the cabin. Up on Blackpine Ridge, an hour's hard climb above town, there was a hunting cabin Emmett's own father had built back in 1971. One room, a wood stove, a roof that sagged in the middle like a sway-backed horse. Nobody had used it in 15 years. The road up there washed out every spring. Dale called it the old shack and said, real generous, that Emmett could have it. It was still in Emmett's name, see. The one thing they never bothered to take because who'd want it? So that's where Emmett went. Not because he chose it, because it was the only door left open to him. He had one thing in the whole world that was still his, and it wasn't the cabin. It was a dog. An old blue tick coonhound named Barley, gray around the muzzle, deaf in one ear, slow in the hips. Emmett had raised him from a pup back when Ruth was still alive, and that dog had slept at the foot of his bed every night since. When the kids cleared out the house, Barley was the one thing nobody wanted, same as Emmett. Dale said the dog was too old to be worth feeding. So the two of them went together, the old man and the old dog, up the only road left to them. A neighbor named Roy Tibbets did the hauling. Roy had a mule and a flatbed wagon, and he was the only soul in Cedar Falls who'd offered Emmett a single thing since the stroke. He loaded the wheelchair, a box of canned food, a rifle, some blankets and Barley, and he walked that mule up the switchbacks to Blackpine Ridge while Emmett held on and watched his whole life get smaller behind him. The town dropped away below the pines, the mill, the church where Ruth was buried, all of it shrinking until it was just trees and cold air and the creak of the wagon. Roy looked at that leaning cabin and shook his head. Emmett, he said, you can't winter up here. This place won't hold heat. First blizzard, you'll freeze. Emmett just looked at the mountain. It's what I've got, he said, and that was the truth of it. A man who'd given everything to everybody had one cold room and an old dog, and a Montana winter coming down the sky like a fist. Roy left him a week's worth of firewood in his own toolbox and promised to come back up when he could get the mule through. Then he was gone down the switchbacks, and Emmett was alone on the ridge. He figured he'd come up here to die quiet. He figured wrong. The first few days near about broke him. Everything took 10 times as long from a wheelchair. Getting water from the creek meant filling a pail half full and dragging himself back over the frozen ground a foot at a time. Getting a fire going meant reaching into the stove from a chair that wouldn't roll where he needed it. And that was the real problem, the floor. Old rough boards with gaps between them wide enough to lose a spoon. Cold air came up through it like the mountain itself was breathing on him. At night, it got so bad his one good leg would cramp up into a knot, and he'd lie there in the dark gritting his teeth, and Barley would climb up against him just to keep him from shaking. Two old souls holding the cold off each other, that was all they had. On the 4th morning, Emmett decided he'd had enough. If he was going to live in this place, he'd fix the draft or die trying. He couldn't stand, but he could still work with his hands. He dragged himself out of the chair and down onto the cold boards, took a pry bar from Roy's toolbox, and went after the rotted planks near the stove where the cold came up worst. It was slow, ugly work. Half his body wouldn't answer him. But those hands still knew how to find the seam in a board and lean on it right. The first board came up easy, soft as bread. So did the second. And the second Emmett got that hole open, Barley went crazy. That old deaf dog shoved his whole head down into the gap under the floor and started digging like his life depended on it. Dirt flew back between his legs. He whined, high and fast, a sound Emmett hadn't heard out of him since he was a pup treeing his first coon. Barley, quit it. Emmett grabbed his collar. The dog wouldn't quit. He'd caught a scent of something down in that crawl space, and he was not coming up until he got to it. He pulled against Emmett's hand with everything left in his old body. Emmett let him go. And then, because there was nothing else to do up on that ridge and no one to stop him, he leaned down into the hole himself and started pulling out more boards and pushing his hand down into the cold dirt where the dog was scratching. His fingers hit metal, Not a pipe, not a nail. Something flat and hard and square, buried maybe a foot down, right under the center of the cabin, right under where his father's chair used to sit all those years ago when Emmett was a boy and this ridge was a place they came to hunt. It took him the better part of an hour, flat on his belly, half his body not working, to dig that thing loose. He scraped his knuckles raw. He had to stop twice to catch his breath. Barley never left his side, nosing at the dirt, whining that same high whine. And when Emmett finally hauled it up into the gray light through the hole in the floor, he was looking at an ammunition box. Old military surplus, olive green, the kind his father brought home from Korea. The latch was rusted shut. Somebody had wrapped the whole thing in oilcloth and wax to keep the wet out, and had done a careful, patient job of it, the kind of job a man does when he means for a thing to last 30 years. His father had been dead 30 years. Emmett sat there on the floor with that box in his lap and his heart going like a young man's. He got a screwdriver into the rusted latch and worked it, sweat coming up on his forehead in that freezing room. Barley put his gray head on Emmett's knee and watched with his one good eye. The latch gave with a snap that echoed in the empty cabin. Inside, on top, was a folded square of canvas. Under the canvas, wrapped in more oilcloth, were 3 cloth sacks, heavy, the kind bankers used to use. And tucked down the side, sealed in wax paper, was an envelope with one word written on the front in his father's slanted hand. The word was Emmett. He opened one of the sacks first because his hands were shaking too bad to open a letter. Coins spilled into his palm. Gold. Heavy gold coins, dozens of them, and under those, silver, and folded paper money gone soft with age. He'd never in his life held that much money at one time. He set it down careful, like it might vanish if he breathed wrong, and just sat there. Outside, the wind came up the ridge and rattled the loose tin on the roof. But inside that cold room, it was suddenly the warmest Emmett had felt in 2 years. He built up the fire. He heated a can of beans and split it with Barley, and he sat with that box beside him. And for the first time since the morning they wheeled him out onto the porch, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was going to be all right. He fell asleep in the chair with his hand resting on the metal lid and the dog at his feet and the whole thing quiet. It felt like the end of the trouble. It was only the middle. He woke to headlights. 2 sets of them, bouncing up the washed-out road that nobody was supposed to be able to drive at night. Emmett hadn't even opened the letter yet. He'd meant to. He'd fallen asleep first. Now there were engines outside his cabin and doors slamming, and a voice he'd know anywhere in the world calling out across the dark. "Dad. Dad, you in there?" It was Dale. Now here's where it turns, because Dale hadn't driven an hour up a mountain in the dark out of love. Emmett knew that before the door even opened. And when it did open and Dale and Marlene came stamping in out of the cold with their coats and their tight faces, Emmett understood something that made his blood run cold. They knew. Somehow they knew about the box, or they knew about something worse. Marlene had a folder under her arm. She always did have a folder. She looked at the pried-up floor and the ammo box open on the table with the gold sitting right there in the lamplight, and her whole face changed. Her eyes went wide and hungry, but she caught herself fast. "Dad," she said, sweet as pie, "we've been worried sick. You can't stay up here. We came to take you somewhere warm." Emmett looked from her to Dale. "Somewhere warm," he repeated. "You mean the home you told me you weren't putting me in?" That's when Dale set his own folder on the table, right next to the gold, and Emmett saw the county seal on the top page. And Dale said the thing that changed the whole nature of this fight. He said, "Dad, we've had you declared incompetent on account of the stroke, so we're going to need you to come with us, and we'll be taking care of," he nodded at the box, "all of this. For you. Let me stop right here for 1 second because you need to understand what just happened. Up to now, this was a story about a man whose kids were greedy and cold. Bad enough. But now it was something else. Now they had a piece of paper from the county that said Emmett Kavanaugh wasn't fit to make his own choices, that he couldn't own anything, that whatever was in that box and whatever was under this cabin belonged to them by law. It wasn't about a house and a truck anymore. It was about whether Emmett had the right to exist as his own man at all, and they had come up the mountain in the dark to make sure of it. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, because this is the part that matters, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one only find the people who need to hear them when you do. All right, back up the mountain. Emmett didn't yell. That wasn't his way, remember. He looked at the folder with the county seal, and he looked at his two oldest children, and he asked them one quiet question. Where's Colton? They glanced at each other, just a flick of the eyes, but Emmett caught it. Marlene said Colton didn't want to come, that he'd gone soft, that he never did have the stomach for hard decisions. And in that little flicker between them, Emmett saw the whole thing plain. Two of his kids had cooked this up. The third had refused. That was worth knowing. That was worth more, right then, than all the gold in that box. Then Emmett reached over, not to the gold, but to the envelope. The one with his name on it in his father's hand. He'd been too shaky to open it before. His hands were steady now. Before you take everything, he said, I'm going to read what my daddy left me. You can wait for that. Dale reached to grab the envelope, and that old deaf coonhound, who hadn't moved fast in 3 years, came up off the floor with his gray lips peeled back and a growl in his chest that stopped Dale's hand cold in the air. Barley put himself between Emmett and the both of them, and he held there, shaking, 40 years too old for a fight and ready to have one anyway. Dale took a step back. He'd known that dog his whole life and never once seen it show a tooth. Emmett opened the letter. It was 2 pages in pencil, dated the year before his father died. And I'm going to tell you close to what it said, because this is the heart of the whole thing. Son, if you're reading this, then you came up to the cabin and you finally got cold enough to fix that floor. I always knew you would. You were the only one of my children who ever fixed a thing instead of leaving it. That's why I left this place to you and not the others. And that's why I hid what I hid where only a working man would ever find it. Emmett's voice cracked. He kept going. The money in the box is what I saved 40 years and never spent, because I wanted it to land in the hands of whichever of my kin needed it most, and life has a way of sorting that out. But the money isn't the reason I chose you. Look in the bottom of the box under the false panel. There's a deed. When I bought this cabin in 1971, I didn't just buy the cabin. I bought the whole of Blackpin Ridge, 640 acres, a full section of old-growth timber and the mineral rights under all of it. It's in my name, free and clear, and this deed passes it to you and you alone. Nobody can touch it but you. Take care of it, son. It'll take care of you. The cabin went dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold off. Marlene's mouth had come open. Dale had gone white. Because these two had spent their whole lives thinking the family was worth a house in town and a foreman's pension. They'd carved up that little pie between them and thought they were clever. And it turned out their grandfather had been sitting on an entire mountain of standing timber, and he'd handed it, on purpose, to the one man they'd shoved out onto a porch and driven away from. That's not real, Marlene said, but her voice didn't believe itself. You can't, Dad, you've been declared incompetent. You can't own. I owned it before your paper, Emmett said, 30 years before, and a judge is going to be real interested to hear how you two got that paper, because I never sat in front of any judge, did I? That landed, because they hadn't. They'd had a lawyer friend push it through on the strength of a doctor's note and Emmett's signatures, the same signatures they'd tricked out of a man half conscious in a hospital bed. And now here was Emmett, cold and thin but clear-eyed as a bell, quoting his own deed and asking questions they couldn't answer. Dale tried to bluster. He said the timber company had already made an offer. That's how they'd found out. A landman had come around the mill asking about the ridge, and Dale went digging in the county records and saw the section listed under the Kavanaugh name and thought he'd hit the jackpot. He thought it was his. He'd figured it'd just fall to the family, easy, once the old man was signed away. He'd driven up here tonight to lock it down before anybody else got wise. "So you knew," Emmett said. "You knew this ridge was worth more than everything you already stole, and you came up here in the dark to take it too. And you brought a paper to say I'm not a man anymore, so I couldn't stop you." He folded the letter along its old creases, careful, the way you'd fold something holy. "Get out of my father's cabin." Now I told you Emmett Kavanaugh never raised his voice. He didn't raise it then either. But there's a kind of quiet that's louder than any shouting, and that's the quiet that filled that little room. Dale looked at his father and at the growling old dog and at the deed in that steady hand, and for the first time in his grown life he understood that he had lost. Not a fight, something bigger. He'd lost the right to ever look this man in the eye again. They didn't take the box. They didn't take Emmett. They backed out the door and got in their vehicles and drove down the mountain, and their headlights swung away through the pines and were gone. Emmett sat a long while in the lamplight. Then he found the false panel in the bottom of the box, just like his father wrote, and there was the deed, yellow and perfect, 640 acres in his name. He held it, and he held the letter, and he put his hand on Barley's head, and the old man cried the way old men cry without much sound for a long time. "Here's what happened after, and I'll give it to you plain because you've earned it. Emmett didn't sell the mountain to the timber company. Everyone thought he would. He didn't. What he did was hire Roy Tibbets, the one neighbor who'd helped him, and Roy's 2 sons, and a handful of men from the old mill who'd been laid off when the big company cut back. He used his father's gold to fix the cabin first, a real floor, a real roof, a ramp he could roll up without help. Then he set those men to selective logging on the ridge, the careful kind his father would have done, taking the old and leaving the young, and he paid them honest wages out of the timber. That mountain gave a good living, and it gave it to the people of Cedar Falls who needed it, exactly the way his grandfather figured life would sort things out. The county competency order got thrown out inside a month, once a real judge saw how it was gotten. The lawyer who pushed it through lost his license. Dale and Marlene were told in a courtroom in front of everyone to give back the house and the pension and the truck. And they did. Emmett got it all back. But you know what he did with the house in town? He sold it. Said he didn't want to sleep in a place his children had taken from him. He stayed up on Blackpine Ridge in his father's cabin made whole, where the air was clean and the only ones who'd stolen from him could never reach. He didn't press charges. People asked him why. A lot of folks thought he should. And Emmett would just say that they had to live inside their own skins now, knowing what they'd done, and there wasn't a jail he could build that was worse than that. That was Emmett's revenge, and it was the quiet kind, the only kind he had in him. He let them keep their freedom and lose their father, and he let the whole town watch them do it. Colton came up the mountain that spring, alone, on foot because the road was still washed out. He got to the top with his boots soaked through, and he couldn't hardly get a word out. He said he was sorry. He said he'd told the others no, he'd told them it was wrong, and he hadn't done enough to stop it, and he'd carry that. He didn't ask for a thing, he just wanted his father to know he'd said no. Emmett looked at his youngest boy a long moment. Then he said, "You want some coffee?" And that was that. Colton stayed. He learned the timber trade from Roy's boys, and he worked that ridge alongside his father. And slow, over years, the two of them built back something the other two had thrown away. Not everybody in this story got redeemed. But one of them walked up a mountain to say the truth, and that counted, and Emmett had never in his life been a man to slam a door on a son who came home honest. Now I have to tell you the last part, and I'll be straight with you. This is the part that's hard. Barley got old. Older than a coonhound has any business getting. He'd been old the day they went up the mountain, and the years up there were good to him, but they were still years. He'd lie in the sun on that new porch with his gray muzzle on his paws and watch Emmett work. And at night he'd climb up against the old man's leg the same as he did that first freezing week, back when the two of them were the only things in the world that still belonged to each other. One morning in Barley's last autumn, Emmett rolled out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee out of habit, the way he still sometimes did, and he called the dog, and the dog didn't come. He found him curled in the sun by the door, gone peaceful in the night, his old body finally quiet. And Emmett Cavanaugh, who'd lost his legs and his home and near about his whole family and never once let anybody see him break. Emmett sat down on that porch and put his big hands over his face and wept like a child. He buried Barley up on the ridge, under the biggest black pine on the whole 640 acres. He dug the grave himself, out of the chair on his belly in the dirt, the same way that dog had dug up the box that saved his life. He said it was only right. Barley found what his father hid. Barley stood between him and the ones who'd have taken it. That deaf old dog gave Emmett back his life, and the least a man could do was put him in the ground with his own 2 hands. He set a flat stone there. No fancy words on it, just the name, Barley. And you want to know the thing that gets me every time? It's this. On the morning they wheeled Emmett out onto that porch and drove off in his truck, he thought he had nothing left in the world. He thought he was being sent up a mountain to die. But his father, 30 years dead, had already left him everything he'd ever need: a fortune under the floor, a mountain under his feet, and the kind of quiet justice that lets a good man keep his soul. And the one creature who never took a thing from him, who only ever gave, was lying right there at his feet the whole time. The people who were supposed to love Emmett Cavanaugh took the house, the truck, and the pension. They forgot the cabin. And in forgetting it, they handed him back the 2 things they could never have understood the worth of: his father's faith in him, and a mountain that would hold the man long after they were gone. Emmett lived up on Blackpine Ridge the rest of his days, warm and free, and his own. And on quiet evenings he'd sit by that big pine where the stone was, with a coffee going cold in his hand, and he'd talk to an old dog like he was still lying right there in the sun. Because in every way that ever mattered to Emmett, he was.